Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth event for the Library Talks. We're excited to bring you some amazing authors this year through these virtual talks. My name is Kelly Chu. I'm the program coordinator, and I will be introducing our moderator tonight and our amazing guest, Anne Leckie. Just a reminder, throughout tonight's program, we'll be taking questions in two ways. Librarians, you can ask questions at your library through the Q&A feature on right on the side, and I see a lot of you have already found it, of the Google Hangouts. And also, if you're sitting in the audience and you've got a smartphone, you can tweet your questions to us. Our handle is @TheLibraryTalks, and you use the hashtag #LibTalks, and your tweets will reach us, and we will ask Anne your questions. So you guys can start sending those questions in now, and we will get to them as many as we can tonight. Also tonight, we have moderating Hank Bankhead. Hank is the assistant director at the San Rafael Public Library and a reviewer for Library Journal. Hank, are you with us?
I am here.
Welcome.
Awesome.
And then, of course, our guest of honor tonight is Anne Leckie, who at this point is basically dripping in awards. She is the author of the Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Award-winning novel Ancillary Justice and its two sequels, and has also published short stories in Subterranean Magazine, Strange Horizon, and Realms of Fantasy. She just completed her first trilogy, and we're looking forward to what she has coming up next. So Anne is coming to us tonight from St. Louis. Anne, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Fabulous. All right, well, I will leave you guys to it. Hank, do you want to start with the first question?
Yes, thanks, Kelly, and thank you, Anne, for being here tonight.
Thank you for having
me. Anne, how do you pronounce radish? Is it like radish or ratch?
I say Raj. I say Raj. Almost all the names in the trilogy, I tried to spell them very consistently in the hope that people wouldn't have trouble pronouncing them. Obviously, this was not an entirely successful effort on my part, but the vowels are all very Latin-y, so a, e, I, o, u for those, and the diphthongs are just one vowel after the other. So I know this one, Sayvarden, for one of the characters. I know in the American audiobook of Ancillary Justice, they actually contacted me to talk to me about pronunciations. So the person who narrates the American audiobook of Ancillary Justice had those pronunciations from me. But when the UK did their audiobooks, and they continued to do the rest of the trilogy just using the UK version, they didn't ask me for pronunciations. And I love that narrator. I think she does a fabulous job, but she doesn't always pronounce things the way that I would.
Cool, thank you. So to follow up, in the language of the Ratch, the thing that was most compelling to me about the book sort of as a whole and the whole series was that they don't distinguish between characters by an exact gender definition, everyone being a her. So as a reader, I found this incredibly fascinating because I had to depart from my genderifying of character and just accept people as somewhat flexible depending on the situation or interpretation. And I noticed you paid very careful attention to not giving away any clues about people in that sense. So how purposeful was this?
So I started out wanting, very simply and very naively, actually, to write about a society that genuinely did not care about gender. There was no gender prejudice, there were no stereotyped gender roles. And I started trying to write this when I first started to write it, assigning binary genders to the characters and using he and she. And I found that I was still following my sort of assumptions about gender roles, and this was frustrating to me. And so I sort of played around with ways to deal with that. And ultimately, I settled on just using the same pronoun for everybody. And I decided it would be she. And the more I started working on it, I said, well, this is a little weird, but the more I worked on it, the better I liked it. And I had kind of the same experience. When I started writing the novel, I had assigned binary genders to some of the characters who appear very early on. But when I started calling everybody she, my concept of them started to kind of slip around a little bit, and it was really super interesting to me. I know there have been one or two folks who have felt that I was being preachy or superior or overly clever using it, but actually it was an education for me to try that as much as anything else, and it was to try and circumvent some assumptions that I was making.
Awesome answer, Anne. And as a follow-up, I was kind of thinking about this as a linguistic approach, and I thought that it kind of represents the sort of evolved nature of the radish in their kind of worldview. Well, why would you define people by gender? The same way you would say, kind of like in a civilized society, why would you have the death penalty? You know, it's kind of a sense of like, yeah, these people are advanced, and when it kind of helps you to buy into their worldview in a sense. Is that?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And it kind of cuts both ways, because the Raj is maybe, they have a lot of fabulous things about them, but there are also some really horrific things about them, right? And so they're not exactly shining examples of great morals and great advancement, but in some ways they kind of are. But I kind of feel like real life is complicated that way. You don't find things that are all good or all bad.
True enough. And as follow-up from Santa Clara City Library, they wonder if there was a screen adaptation, and I was wondering this also, how would you maintain that sort of flexibility of the gender identity?
I have no idea. There is an option for ancillary justice for TV. Of course, an option does not necessarily mean that anything's going to happen. But I honestly do not know, if anything ever did happen, how they would deal with that. I suspect they would have to decide to do something very different from what I had done, that would be kind of its own thing, because I suspect that what I did on the page isn't really doable in a visual medium, not in our culture.
Which is kind of an awesome thing in a way.
Yes.
So about how the Radish are kind of bad guys in a way, coming in and conquering and making everyone ancillaries. How do you conceive of the science of that instantaneous connection of formerly individuals who have their consciousness erased and kind of slaved to an AI?
Well, I have to admit that the communication connection is kind of sufficiently advanced technology, right? It's indistinguishable from magic. It's one of those, I say it works, so it works. On the other hand, the science of how ancillaries can be ancillaries was very much a product of the way that, of the kind of research I was doing into the way that our minds work. Our sense of identity, you would think it's very sort of just common sense. I know who I am, and I know who you are, and I know where I stop, and I know where you start. But it's really not that simple. If you have the right kind of damage, like a stroke, or I suspect a head injury wouldn't do the trick, but you can end up believing that you don't exist, or you can end up believing that you're dead. One of the things that happens sometimes with stroke patients or split brain patients is they'll have like a part of their body where they'll say, well, it's usually the left side. My left arm, that's not my arm, that's somebody else's arm. That's super weird to think about. How could you think, I mean, obviously that's part of your body. How could you genuinely believe it wasn't? Well, our sense of who we are and what's part of us and what's not is really very much a product of the way our brains are made. You make a change in your brain, you make a change in who you believe you are. And so that's kind of the science behind what I was thinking of when I was making ancillaries.
Thank you. And following up on that, the kind of interesting conundrum that's at the center of the book is that the protagonist, being an AI who is suddenly isolated into the body of one of the ancillaries, has sort of opposite to the traditional kind of sense of an artificial intelligence, a very rich emotional life that really came through in her character and all the characters in the book, and that being sort of an unexpected sort of approach to the sort of life of AIs. In a sense, I was thinking about the art in the age of mechanical reproduction. You know that, like that sense of, was that sort of a conscious sort of turning something on its head? In the same way, like in Star Trek, Data becomes like very deep character, and not just like, I am Data.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and actually Data was one of my favorite characters in Next Generation, no question. Although his depiction kind of ran into some things that frustrate me about the depiction of AIs and robots and androids in science fiction, which is the depiction of emotion, as you point out. One of the things that frustrates me is the very frequent division between rationality, intelligence, and logic, and emotion, as though if you could totally remove emotion from the equation, you would be this sort of purely logical, intellectual being that would just behave much more intelligently. Spock is another example of that kind of trope. I don't personally think that's the case. When you see folks who have brain damage that inhibits their being able to experience or understand their emotions, they have serious problems making decisions. It's a serious impairment to not have emotions. And then on top of it, very frequently you'll have a character who's all machine who experiences completely human type emotions. And the assumption will just be, oh, it'll have an emotion. What my favorite is the robot learning to love, you know, learning about what love is, these wonderful human feelings. Except I was asking myself, while I was doing some of the creepy research about identity and such, what is emotion anyway? And emotions, they interact very much with who you are and the culture you're in and your experiences, but they're at base, they're very physical experiences. And if you change a body radically enough, you're going to alter that experience of emotion. So a computer that doesn't have a human body isn't going to have emotion. But the flip side of that is a computer that does have human bodies as part of its makeup is absolutely going to have emotion. It's going to have lots of emotion, particularly if it has lots of bodies. So I was thinking very deliberately about what kinds of emotions the characters I was building were going to have and how that was going to work.
And there was a very interesting contrast between kind of the history of the Empire with ancillaries and the AI to the sort of modern, kinder, gentler Anandar Minai with ships that didn't have ancillaries but had captains they were very close to. So the ships loved their captains, and vice versa. Even though they weren't ancillaries, you sort of showed the kind of different extremes between the relationship of machine and man and being machine and person. I mean, sorry, I said man.
Yeah,
but,
that's okay.
And then at the end, the recognition by the alien, so I'm going to get back to, of significance of the AI being kind of like, oh yeah, these are beings, you know, what's the matter with you humans?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, you said that the kinder, gentler Anandar Minai is removing ancillaries from ships. That's a horrible, horrible thing to do, right?
Yeah.
They're having parts of their body cut off. But then, of course, the flip side is continuing to make ancillaries, right? Which is also a horrible, horrible thing to do. Yeah, it's like no matter what you do, it's going to be awful.
Yeah. Question from Livermore Library. Did you have any input into the design of the book covers? They have very unique characteristics.
So are we talking about the Orbit book covers or the Subterranean Special Edition book covers? I actually had almost no input on the Orbit book covers, which is the John Harris. It's actually one big painting that's been cut into 3, and I think it's really beautiful. I love it a lot. And basically, Orbit said, here's the cover, and I said, oh, it's beautiful. Thank you so much. That was about all the input I had on that. On the Subterranean covers, I was actually asked if there were any artists I would like to have do the cover, and I was shown sort of final-ish versions of the cover to make comments on and see if there were any changes that I wanted to make. I love all my covers, though.
Awesome. Beth from Santa Clara City Library has noticed the multiple Egyptian art motifs in the background. And she wonders, does this indicate anything about your upcoming projects?
No, actually, those have been on the wall for a while. They were on the wall from before I finished Ancillary Justice, in fact. No, I just have a fascination in general with ancient societies, and Egypt is one of them. And the Egyptian things look pretty cool. So.
And I just wanted to throw in, I gotta say this. Related to the Egyptian, there's a book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, where they project that the ancient Egyptians weren't really conscious. And they were
Oh,
actually like your ancillaries?
I think that book is kind of a pile of,
Okay, good. I'm glad you said
yeah.
that. Okay.
Yeah.
And speaking of your writing process, we have a question from Livermore Public Library. What is your writing process like? And I know you went to the Clarion West Writers Workshop, and you were in NaNoWriMo,
Mm-hmm.
and Octavia Butler was mentioned, so I just want to throw it out there.
Yeah, I was honored actually to have had Octavia Butler as one of my instructors at Clarion West the year that I was there. She died some months after that, which was a huge loss, but she was fabulous. It was a huge honor to meet her. So my process is very variable and has changed. I actually wrote my very first novel at doing NaNoWriMo, as you mentioned, and I found that really really important to learn that I could power through and write that much. I had been kind of afraid to put things down on paper before then, and so that was really important to me. But these days, I can't do it. I find that I actually lose more time pushing through and going back to fix it than I would very carefully advancing sentence by sentence. So NaNoWriMo is not a particularly good part of my process right now. Usually what I do is I read huge amounts of nonfiction, and I think and I think, and I go on walks and stuff, and then I sort of get the feeling I'm ready to start writing, and so I sit down and I write, and sometimes I spend whole days just kind of banging my head on the desk and 2 sentences come out. And some days I do several thousand words and it just flies. When I get stuck, my friends laugh at me, actually. I've had a friend of mine who's a writer say, "Oh, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do." And I say, "Oh, I know what to do. You go to your nearest university library and you walk up and down the anthropology stacks and you just pull books off the shelf that look interesting. And then you read whatever seems like it's calling to you. And then finally, at some point, you'll run across whatever the piece of information you need is to move forward." And she laughed at me and she says, "Yeah, that works for you because you're Anne. That wouldn't work for me." But that's actually a really important part of the way that I work. It won't work for everybody, but for any of you out there who are stuck, maybe that's the thing you need to do.
Cool. Joanne from Oizen has a comment about, well, a question. Have you used languages other than English, or do you that handle gendered pronouns in world building? For example, Tagalog uses sia instead of he or she or his or hers.
I haven't actually. I don't have a whole lot of experience with non-Indo-European languages. I don't know about Tagalog if it's Indo-European or not. But I learned relatively late in my world building that actually that the majority of languages on this planet actually don't use gendered pronouns, which was something that seemed kind of odd to me, but I don't know why it should seem odd, since quite a few people in the world speak without gendered pronouns quite naturally and don't think it's odd. But that is something that I could actually stand to learn more about, absolutely.
Cool. And speaking of spaceships, they were mentioned in the intro, so I thought we should mention spaceships. I was struck after finishing the series that the titles, Ancillary Justice, Ancillary Mercy, and Ancillary Sword, correspond to the ship classes in the world. And if I get this right, Justice is like the troop carrier.
That's correct.
The bigger one, Justice of Torin being the famous song collector, which I want to ask about also. But was that pretty much intentional, you coming up with classes of ships and making them the titles, or did that just happen?
It was sort of intentional and it sort of just happened. A lot of the world building before I started writing was just kind of incidental. You know how you just sit around and put things together and they seem cool and you tell yourself little stories and stuff. And the ship class names came from that stage of the world building. When I realized that I had the plot for a trilogy, I said, well, I can take these 3 classes. And originally, the titles of the novels were ship names. Excuse me. The original title of Ancillary Justice was Justice of Torin. That was its original title. The original title of Book 2, oh, excuse me again, was Sword of Adagaris. That was the title of 2. And then the title of 3 was supposed to have been Mercy of Collar. And when I submitted the book, my agent, I didn't tell my agent about the other two books, and even though I'd started writing the second one. And he said, well, Justice of Torin, it's kind of opaque. It doesn't mean anything. These days it might to people who'd already read the book, but how about Ancillary Justice? And I was like, sure. And I thought, and I can keep my trilogy titles intact if I just replace the ship names with the ship classes. So that's kind of how that happened.
And in a follow-up, the way that you sort of compose those names kind of alludes to the awesome power of the Radish. Like that they'll name their ship Mercy, but it's going to come in and do you wrong there. Or like Justice, yeah, we're here with justice, but we're going to conquer you. So that small part really kind of encapsulates the whole in some weird way. I was really captivated with the gloves. Like I sensed if I was a member of the Radish, like say Varden, if I was seen, I could be completely naked, but if I had no gloves on, I would feel not dressed.
Yep.
You know? So
yep.
What's up with the hands?
It was just a world-building detail that seemed cool. There is some background to it. There's a cultural history to it, but I didn't feel like it needed to be on the page, and it just seemed like something
Right.
that was kind of different. Also, I was kind of thinking about the ways that what we think of as just common decency is really very culturally determined. We think of it, oh, well, naturally, a person who's
Right.
naturally modest obviously is going to go out of their house with a hat on, right? Or, you know, obviously we wear pants in public. Well, is that really because it's naturally just obviously decent, or because our society has a narrative about what parts of yourself you cover up? I mean, those things change from culture to culture. And so I was just kind of playing with that a little bit. And also, gloves are kind of cool, right?
Yeah. And then the tea, like the tea sets, choosing the tea set scene where Breck's helper, personal assistant, was able to go into Anandar Minai's private stash, highest of the high, and get the most awesome tea set ever. It's like that made their day and their week and their month. And then the significance of the broken tea set.
Yeah, absolutely. The tea is very much a sort of a hat tip to C.J. Cherryh, and I don't know how many of y'all listening have read C.J. Cherryh at all. I love her work. In particular, I love her Foreigner series, and tea plays a huge part in the culture that series of books is kind of centered around. But also, I like tea a lot myself. And so once I said, well, I'll put tea in here, and so that'll be my hat tip to Foreigner, but also I'll get to drink a lot of tea for research. And so once it's there, I'm going to use it for all it's worth, right? So that's kind of where that came from.
And that the Foreigner book being one of your favorite 10 books in the Publisher's Weekly article, which everyone should check out. And could you talk, this is a question from Kelly, could you talk a little more about the science fiction books that influenced you as both a reader and a writer, in addition to those 10 in the article and or anything else?
So largely, I read a huge amount of stuff when I was a kid. I think like a lot of writers, I've read a lot. I spent a lot of my Saturdays at the Carpenter Branch Library in St. Louis City and read through just about everything they had. So at least of kid science fiction. And then I snuck over to the adult side before I was actually supposed to be over there and started pulling books off the shelf. So there's a lot that I've read that I don't doubt has influenced me that I don't honestly remember what it was. But I became a tremendous fan of Andre Norton, who shows up in the Publisher's Weekly list. I just was enchanted with her work from very early on, and I think she's a writer who she wrote a huge amount and was very widely read, but maybe doesn't get brought up very often when people talk about the past masters of the genre, but I suspect she's had a pretty large impact on the field because I think a lot of people read her, particularly when they were younger. I'm not sure how easy she is to find these days, but I just enjoyed the heck out of her work. So Andre Norton has been a huge influence. I also was, from about high school age, a huge fan of Jack Vance, who also turns up on my list. Vance wrote, he was kind of old-fashioned in a lot of ways, but he just wrote gorgeously, just absolutely beautifully, had the most beautiful visuals, has a way of depicting really strange and alien human cultures that's just, I find, really gratifying, really amusing, really, really just fabulously done. And when I first wrote my first novel, and I gave it to some friends to read, and so it was the first novel I ever wrote, so it really wasn't very good, right? And some one or two friends of mine were like, I feel like I'm reading with your hands over my eyes. I can't see anything. And I said, well, where am I going to go to learn how to do visuals? Well, I read a whole lot of Jack Vance. I sat down and consciously looked at, how does he do a visual scene? How does he set the scene when he does it? So he's definitely been an influence. Cherry has been a tremendous influence. I think folks who have read Foreigner or who may read Foreigner in the future will see just how big an influence she's been on the ancillary books. There's just been tons of stuff, but I think Andre Norton and C.J. Cherry and Jack Vance are the biggest names I can think of from when I was a kid in terms of science fiction. There were other folks who really influenced me in terms of fantasy. I read the Mary Stewart Arthurian thing. I went through a huge Arthurian phase, but that's probably the quickest answer I could give.
Thanks. And then you chose of the Ursula Le Guin books, The Left Hand of Darkness, which wasn't surprising in a way, given the gender-changing characters. But you mentioned other things besides that, a chase scene on the ice. So, and I would, if thinking out loud, I thought of Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin related to you, particularly, in the sort of thoughtfulness of the sort of narrative that you produce. So did you choose that Ursula Le Guin book because of the gender thing, or is that really your go-to one?
I think that's probably my go-to Le Guin. I actually did not read Left Hand of Darkness until after I was halfway through the first draft of Ancillary Justice. I knew about it. I knew the famous thing about it. And so that was always in the back of my mind, but I hadn't read it. And finally I was like, you know what, I really need to read this. And I sat down and read it, and I was like, yeah, I should have read this a long time ago. It's a fabulous book. The thing that it's famous for, which is the pronouns for her genderless aliens, is a thing, but it is certainly not the most significant thing about that book. The whole book is fabulous.
Cool. From the Twitter stream, are you excited about the new Star Wars movie, Force Awakens?
I was just saying to a friend of mine that it's weird, but I'm not. And I'm a person, I was, I think 11 when the first Star Wars movie came out. And, oh my gosh, I was in the theater. I saw it as many times as I could in the theater. When Empire Strikes Back came out, I rushed to the theater as soon as I could. When Return of the Jedi came out, I actually had exams that day. I was in high school, and I took the bus straight from my last exam to the nearest theater and stood in line and got tickets and saw it. It was, I was a huge Star Wars fan. I used to own a copy of Splinter of the Mind's Eye. The friend who I was talking about was like, oh my gosh, I'd totally forgotten about that. And the prequels, they had some cool things about them, and they were okay. But at this point, I guess they kind of took some of the charm out of anticipating what further would be done with it. Maybe it'll be fabulous. I will probably go to see it because my son is a huge fan. And yeah, maybe it'll be good. I hope it'll be good, but I can't get any enthusiasm up for it.
Okay, I feel the same way. So from Jesse Wolf, and I had to kind of parse this initially because I wasn't able to read it. He's curious about your decision to have darker skin in the Radish be the more elite status.
I kind of wanted I was over the time that I was working on the books, I was sort of listening to a number of different conversations about science fiction and social issues, and one of the things that got brought up that was new to me to think about was just how frequently science fiction in the far future seems completely white. Existing ideas about physical beauty and about would be just sort of transported thousands of years in the future, and it would seem as though like entire continents of humanity had never made it off of Earth because everybody in the future was white. And I thought about that the first few times I heard that comment, and I was like, you know what? They have a point, and maybe I don't want to do that. And so I decided very consciously that I wasn't going to do that, that I was going to build a world where there was a genuine variety of folks. So it's not only dark skin in the book, obviously, but there are quite a lot of dark-skinned people. And of course in the Rach, as you say, the dark skin is more prestigious, which was in some ways kind of a simplistic turnaround of the way some cultures view light skin as being more prestigious here, but at the same time it's kind of nice to change things up and not have that assumption rammed home all the time.
Thank you for that. A question from Joanne about the ancillaries. Was that in any way related to like the Borg? As you know, resistance is futile.
Not consciously, but you know what? I did watch a lot of Star Trek Next Generation. I was a Next Generation fan when it first came out. So I can't tell you that, gee, I don't know anything about the Borg, because I totally did. So maybe it was there in the back of my mind. I don't know.
And a follow-up for that, my assumption when reading the book was basically, once you were made an ancillary, there was no going back. Because I could see a different book where, okay, you're going to have recovering ancillaries, and they have to like figure out who they are. But my interpretation was no way or no how.
No way, no how. And in fact, that's a trope. Once again, that's a very common trope, and a number of people kind of expected that. I do get that question fairly frequently. Could we bring the person who Breck was before she was made into an ancillary? Could that person be brought back? And I'm like, wow, I'm not even interested in that question.
Right.
I mean, and it's cool that other people are interested. We're interested in what we're interested in, right? But I kind of feel that recover the person who you were before thing to me is sort of related to the robot that wants to be human trope, which is also one that I dislike. It's like, oh, I'm not good enough. I have to be this other order of being in order to be adequate. And actually, I kind of have a whole rant on that I should not uncork right now. But that's a trope that's always troubled me, and so I was deliberately avoiding all of that.
And you kind of pushed it forward in that Breck like embraced the fact of who she was, she, whatever, who she was, and kind of worked with it, you know. And then the sort of dimension of, and I'm going to get to one other question here real soon, of her being a collector of songs. That seemed very sort of magical in a sense. Like they said, oh yeah, of course it was Breck who was minutes away from dying out there, and she was humming away. So where did that come from?
That was actually when I conceived the idea of characters with multiple bodies actually came very early in the world building. To some extent, Justice of Torn and Anandromy and I are the sort of central point of my world building. That's where everything started. And so when I was thinking to myself, gosh, if I were a being that had 20 bodies, if I were one-esque, and I had 20 bodies, what would I do? Because that's how you kind of get into a character's mind. What would you do in their situation if you were who they were? And I said, gosh, you know, if I had 20 bodies, I could sing choral music all by myself. And I am just the kind of nerd that would think that was totally cool. And because I totally would if I had 20 bodies. And then I thought, oh, you know, music, the way it gets used in written fiction a lot, it's often not used terribly well. Very often a writer will want to use like a soundtrack and put lyrics in, or will even more dangerously write their own lyrics to a song that they hope will lend some kind of atmosphere to the story. But of course the music isn't there on the page. We respond very viscerally to music, but lyrics on the page don't give us that same response. And that, or else it's romanticized, right? It's the super talented musician who, you know, does all these great things with their music. And I'm like, yeah, that would be kind of tacky, and I don't want to go there. And I resisted it for a long time. And finally, it just wouldn't leave me alone. And so I said, all right, you know what? I'm going to lean into it. If she's going to sing music, she's going to really be into it. That's just going to be all there is to it. And so that's kind of where that came from.
Awesome. And then a follow-up from the comments. The protagonist that we refer to, Breck, by many names, how do you usually refer to her yourself? Of the three that you've mentioned, Breck, Justice of Torin, One-esque.
It actually depends on where in the story I'm talking about her. So when I'm talking about One-esque, for instance, interacting with Lieutenant On, I'll usually say One-esque. When I'm talking about the whole ship, as distinguished from just One-esque, I'll say Justice of Torin. But most of the time, when I'm just talking about the protagonist of the book, usually I just say Breck.
And it's interesting when you mention the relationship between One-esque and Lieutenant On. That setting of the stage, it just occurred to me, like there's such romantic elements in that. And then following up with her sister on the space station, like that's like deep emotional stuff. I love that. From Huntington Beach, they're asking about the specific genders. Did you have specific genders in mind when you were creating your characters, or did you not know yourself? Following up on the first part of your...
So, as I said earlier, when I started the novel, I was assigning binary genders to characters, but I didn't get very far before I changed that and started using she for everyone. Characters who came on stage after I had made that decision, I have no freaking idea what their gender is. I don't know, because I didn't need to know. It's like, did I need to know if the character was left-handed? I didn't need to know. So I never bothered to think about that question. So the vast majority of characters, I never tried to determine what their gender might be. There are a few that I do know, and most of them do get pointed out. There's a character in Sword, and who also appears in Mercy, who does get gendered. There's two characters in Sword who are gendered, because they're spoken about in another language. But all the other characters, people occasionally ask me. I've had translators. You know, Strigan, the doctor who Breck gets the gun from. Translators sometimes get very distraught about Strigan. Not distraught. The translators have been fabulous, and will say, "But what about Strigan? Because I think we can figure out what gender is Strigan, because I have to know." And I'm like, I don't know. Just call her she, because I have no idea.
And another question on pronunciation. I know we're already covered some pronunciation, but of those of us who didn't read the audiobook, how do you pronounce the R?
Oh, just like a regular R. I know some folks who've told me they like to do that fancy sort of I can't even do it. There are a couple of different R's, and some folks like to do those different R's, but I just say Rach or Rachai. Nothing really fancy there. I'm trying to think what other things people... Oh, them! Oh, excuse me. I'm looking over on the side, and I see the text, and you mean the aliens, the R.
The R, yeah.
The R. Yeah, I wrote myself into a corner with them. I thought it looked... Actually, that was kind of a joke when I was writing the first novel, and somebody made a typo, and I said, "Oh, I'll name some aliens that," and then I liked it the more I kept going with it. And so I wrote myself into a corner with it because I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. I imagine it as sounding kind of like a growl, not really like a word. But you're right, that one is kind of hard to pronounce. But when I have to, I say the R.
And if I remember correctly, the R were erased by the Ratch, right?
No, they almost were. That almost came to a war, but that was the sort of tipping point for what happened out at Eam, where the ship came into the system and the governor ordered it to be attacked.
And then speaking of aliens, I really love the Presker. Is that how you would say it?
That's how I say it. Yeah.
And the fact that I got a sense that the translator was very far removed from the actual Presker and was sort of like a creation in order to talk with humans. And the way that you illustrated that Presker translator ambassador being kind of playful but very omnipotent and kind of like the swallowing of the oyster, you know, and having to kind of flex in order to understand these humans, you were kind of showing how humans are kind of weird from an outside perspective, which was awesome. And then you ended up with like the sort of sense of significance.
Yeah.
That seemed like a blow for the revolution.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I had a lot of fun with the Presker translators. In the second book, when I brought on translated Leckie, and I realized very quickly that she was not going to be on stage very long, and I was very unhappy with myself because I was having a heck of a lot of fun writing her. She was just so fun to write, and I was like, she's not going to be on stage very long. And so I promised myself that when book 3 came, I was going to get as much stage time as possible for the Presker translator who was coming in on that book. And I do still to this day, I can see people tweet when they'll say, oh, here comes translated Leckie. I love her. She's fabulous. She's like the best character in this book. And then I wait for the other shoe to drop for them to realize that she's not going to be there very long, and then I get the really angry tweet. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but wait till you get to book 3. Yeah, they were a super amount of fun, absolutely.
And what was so interesting, it's kind of like the death of a character from Downton Abbey, but in the next book, when the next translator comes, she's like, oh, I guess I'm not the Leak, I'm someone else. And that's like, you know, they're really flexible about like who they are, and it's like the Presker seem like kind of awesome beings.
Yeah, and I know more about. Occasionally, somebody will say, "Well, how did that happen? And what is up with the Presker translator's sense of identity?" And I'm like, I know more than is on the page, but I'm not really going to say anything because that kind of makes it more fun and mysterious. Yeah.
And that is a perfect lead-in. Let's talk about what's in your future. Imperial Radish is finished. So what can we look forward to next from Ann Leckie?
Well, that particular trilogy is finished, and but as I hope folks have noticed, I spent a lot of time and effort constructing that universe, so I'm not going to be ditching it anytime soon.
Cool.
So the thing that I'm working on now is a book set in that universe, but it will not be in the same time or space as the trilogy, and I'm thinking for right now that that third book sort of closes out Breck's story, and so I don't currently plan to return to that, but I do plan to stay in this universe. It's a big universe. I can do an awful lot of different things, and there's a lot of space for me to play. So yeah, what I'm working right now is what I intend to be a standalone set in that universe.
And a question also came up that you've also written quite a bit of short fiction as opposed to the long trilogy. Can you say a little about the difference between writing long and short fiction, especially within sci-fi?
They're really different. They're really different. And very often sort of newly aspiring science fiction and fantasy writers are told to write short fiction first, and that will sort of be training wheels for writing novels. I don't happen to think that's really the case. I do think there's a lot you can learn writing short fiction, but you won't learn how to write novels from short fiction in particular. So if you really hate short fiction, don't kill yourself writing it. But it's a very different process. The first thing that I wrote was this big novel, and I said, well, I'm going to try and write short fiction. And so I read a lot of short fiction. I worked very, very hard to kind of work down to shorter lengths. And one of the things about short stories is you don't have the room for for any digression at all. You have to make absolutely every element count. It has to be doing more than one thing. You can't just put something in because it's cool and maybe later on it'll pay off, which is something that's very useful about novels. You throw a bunch of stuff in the first chapter and then later on you go, oh, I can grab that thing and work it through and it'll be a structural thing. You can't really do that with short fiction. And so I've been writing short fiction for a couple of years, and I said, well, I'll go back and now I'll write Justice of Torn, I'll write Ancillary Justice. And I sat down and tried to begin writing it, and I was too intimidated. I said, no, I have to tell myself that this is a series of linked novellas maybe, then I can start. And I began to try and set that first scene, and I began to sort of panic, and I thought, there's no way I can get everything in here in the space allowed. And then I realized, I said, oh, I've got more than 5,000 words. This is a novel. I can stretch out and do what I need to do and go back and cut things out later, and it'll be okay. So the whole mindset for how to proceed, at least for me, is very different for novels.
Good. Thank you for that. You mentioned something earlier that I wanted to follow up on, and that you had experienced many people finding things in your novels that you didn't intend. Sort of like that found in translation thing, which is awesome. And which of these pleased you the most, and which the least?
That would be hard to say. I have been really intrigued by the different ways that different readers will encounter the same text. This was one of the things where I, as a reader, will have very decided opinions about what a writer is doing when I read a book. But as a writer, where I know what I was intending to do, and then I'll see people say, well, obviously Leckie is making a reference here to Ian Banks, The Player of Games. That was one recently. And the truth of the matter is, I have never ever read The Player of Games. I've read 2 Banks novels, and one of those was after I finished Ancillary Justice. And Banks was a tremendous loss. His work is fabulous, and I need to read more of it. But one of the interesting things to me is the number of people who say, for instance, well, this is obviously a response to or strongly influenced by Banks' work. And it would be an honor to be considered in that company, but in fact it's not. And I find that really super interesting. I find it really interesting the way that people approach the identity of ancillaries. So, for instance, as you say, there's no going back from being an ancillary. I consider it as a change in what that body's identity is, right? But for a number of folks, they're coming in assuming that identity means a history or a set of memories and a particular body. And so those folks, those readers often assume that the ancillaries have had all their memories removed, are mind wiped. And that really interests me. They're not mind wiped. I don't say that anywhere in the text. But what interests me is when people come at a text with different kinds of assumptions. It's not that there's a right way or a wrong way to read it. There's just your way to read it. You can get very different things out of a book. And I'm finding that really super interesting, being able to sit in the author position and watch people comment on their different responses to the book.
It just occurred to me that I had been one of those mind wipe people, okay? Like mind wipe, but cool. It made me think of The Host, Stephanie Meyer, where you kind of had the host was kind of, have you read that?
I have not.
Okay. Well, in that, the host like takes over like biologically, but in the background, the original person's kind of there too, and there's this struggle, and it's all about that. So it's awesome that you did not go there. Totally wonderful.
Yeah.
Another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go.
The mind swap. The mind swap trope is also the body swapping trope is also a common science fictional trope that I kind of have problems with and wanted to avoid. It doesn't make any sense to me on a scientific or intuitive level, and I find it kind of frustrating. So I definitely was avoiding that.
Another thing, I looked at your Wikipedia entry. Like a good librarian, we learn from Wikipedia. And I saw that space opera was repeated a lot, and I was wondering about that because on one hand I embrace space opera and I'm totally cool with it, and in this particular sense with the singing, you know, that kind of makes sense. But on another level, space opera seems like a very limiting kind of notion. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it can. Almost any sort of category, any kind of category, can kind of seem limiting. And space opera in particular, which has its roots in the really cheap, lazy kind of pulp early stories that, you know, but there are things about those stories that are really engaging, that sort of sense of adventure, that sense of widescreen drama, that's really cool. And I think those things are, among other things, are one of the reasons why writers over and over keep kind of trying to rehabilitate space opera. It just kind of keeps coming around. It was, what was it, 10 years ago? We had the new space opera, which was mostly British authors doing some really fabulous stuff. Because that sort of widescreen, high stakes, high drama kind of story is, you know, it feels high and intense for a really good and basic reason, and you want to draw on that. And so you can sort of stick with it in a way that's limiting, or you can say, all right, this is where I'm starting, and I'm going to do something interesting and different with it.
Cool, cool. And you make a very good point that that sort of space opera is like a jumping off to, like, you know, to the universe and beyond. Buzz Lightyear. So awesome. So we had a question here. Seeing as we're in a library and we're always looking for a new book to read, do you have any new books or authors you're excited about that you wanted to give a shout out to, like, our, you know, universal audience here?
I do have some, although I do have to say, ironically, I got into this business because I love to read, and now that I am a professional writer, I hardly have any time to read, which is a shame in a lot of ways. Recently, I read Emma Newman's Planetfall, which I strongly recommend. Sort of a colonizing a distant planet kind of a story. It's almost difficult to talk about without spoilers, but I really strongly recommend it. I really enjoyed Becky Chambers' Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, or is it A Long Voyage to a Small Angry Planet? That's one that's not hard science fiction by any means, but just a lot of fun. I think if you enjoyed Firefly, you'll almost certainly enjoy Becky Chambers. In fantasy, I've been telling everybody about, because I did get to read it before it came out, Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown, which is a sort of Regency romance kind of thing, but with dragons and magic. It's almost kind of like P.G. Wodehouse meets Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, kind of. I strongly recommend it. It's light and fun and frothy and serious where it needs to be, but it's really enjoyable.
And that was Sorcerer to the Crown?
Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho.
And then you mentioned Firefly, and I can't help but ask, do you have any favorite movie or TV in the science fiction genre that you're, you know, into at all?
If you were to ask me my very favorite science fiction movie, I would have to say 2001, because that was very clearly one of the best science fiction movies ever made. It would be hard to top. Recent ones, you know what? I'm going to just say it in public. I love Jupiter Ascending with an unironic love. I know a lot of people panned it. I can see why they panned it. I think their lives must be less colorful than perhaps they could be. I love Jupiter Ascending a lot. Television shows, that's when I haven't very often had the time to invest in watching a lot of television shows. The one thing, which isn't science fiction, the one thing that I do tune into every week is Elementary, which I just adore. I recently discovered Person of Interest on Netflix and have been enjoying the heck out of it. And so far, I think I'm halfway through season 3, and I'm really enjoying it and highly recommend it.
Awesome. So we're getting to the end here, just 5 minutes. Anyone in the audience there that has additional questions, send them our way. I am interested about your relationship with Octavia Butler again, and I assume you've read some of her work.
Oh yes.
And I have my own favorites, but I was wondering what kind of stands out for you in her kind of bibliography.
I think Lilith's Brood is the one that has stayed with me the most and the longest. Although, yeah, really fabulous. Although Kindred is also kind of heavy duty, right? You don't forget that one soon. Absolutely. She was really amazing, and I have not come anywhere close to reading all of her work, and I need to read more. But boy, that was a huge loss. She was really fabulous.
I read about what happened, and it was like, what? I found after I started reading the Adulthood Rights, the Imago, that whole thing, that she had written Clay's Ark, which I had read initially, like one of her earlier works about this spaceship with this virus, and everyone turns into these things, and it's like, dude, that was crazy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Shout out to Octavia Butler. Question from the questions. Do you see any big current trends in SF? Anything you particularly like or dislike?
I am liking the trend for more translated science fiction to make its way into the U.S. I was really happy to see Three-Body Problem win the Hugo this year.
Yeah.
Really happy to see the work that they're doing at Haikasoru, bringing in Japanese science fiction. I think we could stand to have more translated stuff, because there's really a lot of stuff that if you only read English, you don't see, and I think that's a great trend. I think the internet has really helped a number of authors become more visible who maybe wouldn't have been in a more traditional environment where you didn't have that sort of voice. But mostly, one of the things I love about science fiction is how varied it is, and so I find it every now and then you'll see somebody, oh, this trend for such and such is bad, or oh, science fiction should get diamond hard and not use FTL and all this, and I'm like, what? Science fiction should be a million different things. It should all be there. The diamond hard stuff with no FTL, super mundane, all the way up to the, the stuff that's very almost surreal, literary, hardly science fiction. It needs to all be there. And so I find it hard to disapprove of any particular trend so long as there's a bunch of other stuff happening too.
Okay, last question. 2001, HAL 9000 was a singing computer. Did that influence you in any way?
Hal is an awesome character. Hal singing did not, but later on when somebody asked me, we want you to write 300 words about the sounds of science fiction, and I was like, oh, of course, I have to talk about Hal singing Daisy. So once again, the first time I saw 2001, I was like 4 years old. It was showing at a theater, and the adult who was watching me didn't want to miss it and took me to the theater, which they shouldn't have done. But it made a huge impression on me, so maybe it did. Like the Borg, it's all there in the back of my mind, but it certainly wasn't conscious.
And the real last question, one more from Huntington Beach. The first book seemed to jump around quite a bit and wasn't linear, so it seemed hard to follow initially with that, back in time. The second book was easier to follow. Was it intentional to write the first book that way?
I actually started out writing the book in chronological order, and it didn't work. Largely because, in fact, I had started up even further in the timeline. I started in the temple with that terrible thing that happens in the temple. And my readers looked at that, and they said, oh my God, we hate Lieutenant On. And I said, oh no, you can't hate Lieutenant On. If you hate Lieutenant On, the book is not going to work. If there are readers out there who hate Lieutenant On, that's okay, it's cool. You get whatever you get out of it. I'm not disapproving of you. But I realized that I was going to have to start somewhere else, and I was going to have to start in a way that when that pivotal moment comes later in the book, that it happens the way I needed it to happen. And what I ultimately found was that to start in the present and then drop back in the past and go back and forth was the only way to get the effect that I was after.
Thank you, Anne. I think that was our last question, and I for one, love Lieutenant On. She's put in a difficult position. So it's 7:31, and Kelly, do you want to...
Yeah, I'm back. I also love Lieutenant On, just for the record. And I think that we're going to wrap up here. Thank you, Hank, for leading the conversation tonight, and thank you, obviously, Anne, for being so amazing and answering all our questions so thoroughly. Our first guest in the new year is going to be internationally best-selling thriller writer Tess Gerritsen. So Rizzoli and Isles fans, we hope to see you here. And for tonight, we are done. So good night, everyone. Good night, Anne, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Good night. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Anne. You're awesome. Thanks, Kelly.